So welcome to this session, and in this session we have a guest. We have Dr. Roland Wittje, Associate Professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Madras. Dr. Roland specializes in the history of science and technology. So I have invited him to join us in this session for a discussion on the emergence of science as an important paradigm in Europe, and that which subsequently led to the emergence of the Industrial Revolution. Hope you remember that we had a very brief discussion about Industrial Revolution, which is considered as one among the a series of important revolutions that shook Europe during those very important times. So, Dr. Roland, we can start this discussion with a general your observations about the rise of science as an important explanatory paradigm, especially as opposed to that of the religion, because this particular shift is a very important one in sociological theory. You know that Auguste Comte talks about positivism, and he borrows this scientific methodology as the most important methodology that can be used within social sciences to understand society. So this emergence of science, which was initiated by a very important scientist, and that had a very profound impact on social sciences as well.
Yes. Obviously, the scientific method, which was kind of developed to study the natural world and describe a law-like behavior of the natural world, was then extended to the social world and to humans. Yes, so we usually talk about the Renaissance, the early modern period, also as the period of the so-called scientific revolution, even though the term of scientific revolution has really been criticized very much. Stephen Shapin, who has written one of the best books on this, starts it with there's never been a scientific revolution, and this is a book about it. But obviously we have a very important period from usually starting with the times of Copernicus and the transformation of a worldview with the Earth in the into the center to a heliocentric worldview. So from Ptolemean to a Copernican worldview as the start of the scientific revolution. And usually we can say with Isaac Newton and Newtonian mechanics as it comes later as the end, but then we can even look into the times of the Enlightenment of the, obviously Newton, that would be the late 17th and early 18th century, and the time of the Enlightenment of the 18th century really as kind of the closure of this kind of period of the scientific revolution and the emergence of what we can call a scientific understanding of the natural world. And also we used to be talking about the scientific method, but I would also say like a whole series of kind of scientific methods that developed during this period.
Okay. Yeah, while we understand or while we usually talk about this Renaissance or the emergence of scientific revolution, we usually tend to understand it as a phenomenon that happened within Europe. But how far this perception is right? Because we know that the historical exchanges have been happening. So what are the kind of, where do we trace these origins from?
I mean, we obviously have a lot of other transformations. Like one of the important transformations is very much a religious transformation that happened within Europe, which is known as the Reformation, or you can say a series of reformations. Obviously, we have Protestantism, the rise of Lutheran Protestantism, but we also have a change of a lot of other historical. We have a lot of other historical changes within world history, right? Like if you look at we can say specifically the fall of the Byzantine Empire and the rise of the Ottoman Empire, for example, and also the Islamic rulers being driven out of Spain and Portugal, and then Spain and Portugal subsequently becoming the places of origin of the voyages of discovery. I mean, we know very well about Columbus and Vasco da Gama, and really very, very profound geopolitical changes, really, right? And sitting here in India, it's very interesting that obviously both of Both of them were very much inspired by finding a new sea route, a new trading route to India. So obviously this is not a new thing. I mean, knowledge about India and trading with India and other parts of Europe, of Asia, has a very, very long history back to antiquity, to Roman times. But with these kind of geopolitical changes, there was coming up the need for this kind of very lucrative trade to find new trading routes, which really motivated these new voyages. And obviously, these new voyages also then metaphorically became new voyages to new territory. So geographically, if we think about geographical knowledge, and this is also what started to question the existing geographical knowledge, that this is kind of an artifact of history, that we think people in ancient times thought that the Earth was a disk and not a sphere. That's not really true. People knew, or many people knew very well, that Earth was a sphere. But still, there was a lot of unknowns, specifically America as a continent, right? And with new lands and new geographies being discovered, also new specimens, for example, were discovered, new people were discovered, which didn't really fit very well in the old systems of knowledge and of knowledge classification.
And coming back to this question of Reformation, because Protestantism is seen as a very important rational approach to the whole idea of religion. And how far will you be able to make a connection between a rational-based religious movement and the rise of the reason in the scientific field?
Look, again, I mean, it would be from a historical point of view very positivist to draw a very linear history here, right? Like specifically if you look at, let's say, Luther's or Protestantism's comment on Copernicanism, for example. It wasn't necessarily that they embraced all these kind of new ideas. What was very new is the whole idea to question the authority of the church. Right? And that was very important. So it was about questioning old authority. And it was also about asking people, it was about the rise of book print, for example. People would read their own books, right? Like before, you would have a situation where Latin was the language of the church, right? Like, and people who wouldn't be speaking Latin, they wouldn't understand what was being said in the church. And this was the time when the Bible was then translated into vernacular languages, into local languages, and ordinary people were supposed to be reading the Bible and supposed to be attentive, and supposed to understand, and supposed to reason with the Bible, right? And obviously there was a lot of, if you compare the reality of the Bible and the reality of the natural world, obviously there are certain discrepancies, right? Like, and how do you account for these discrepancies, right? So how do you bring your reading of the Bible together with with your experience of the world, right? And how do you reason for that, right?
And one of the very interesting scientists whom we come across in the history is Galileo Galilei. Who had a very problematic encounter with the church, who was subjected to Inquisition. And so can you tell us more about him, his arguments and his lingering influence on this whole scientific revolution?
I mean, we see also there have been made some arguments by actually an important sociology, Robert Merton, about the link between Protestantism and the rise of modern science. Obviously, if you go to Italy, if you turn to Italy, we haven't really the Protestantism or the rise of Protestantism in Italy. But what's very important about Galileo, who has been, I mean, Galileo is important for several reasons in our story, not only for his kind of encounter with the church. So we can say, if we look at Copernicus and the Copernican worldview, for the longest time it was actually very uncontroversial, because it was rather a question of how to interpret this. Is this a new interpretation of how the world really looks, or is this just kind of a mathematical trick? Right? Like you can say, we use this just as a trick, but we are not saying this is really truth. In the true world, the sun is not really in the center.
So in that sense, they did not really take on the church.
They did not really take on the church. What Galileo was really doing is was taking on the church in terms of the authority of interpretation. Right, like how do we have to understand this, right? Like, and also there was certainly this kind of idea that the mechanics of the heavens and the mechanics of the earth were fundamentally different from each other, right? Like the heavens were perfect, right? Like, I mean, there was like the perfect celestial world and the very imperfect terrestrial world, which had a lot of grounding in kind of religious understandings, right? Like about the perfectionism of the heavens and the
imperfection of
the imperfection of the earth, right? And for example, with Galileo's approach to approach the moon, for example, with the telescope and show the imperfection of the moon, right? He was bringing in a connection between what you can say the mechanics of the earth and the mechanics on earth and the mechanics on heaven, right? Like and questioning this idea about the perfectionism of the science or the movement of the stars and the imperfection on earth. And he was also questioning, okay, the authority of the Bible to explain natural phenomena. I wouldn't say, I mean, sometimes this is explained as an episode of secularism. It wasn't really about questioning the existence of a God or not. That wasn't what Galileo was about. I mean, that comes much later, right? Like this comes like in the French, during the times of the French Revolution and Laplace and an understanding of Newtonianism, where he would say, where he was asked, in his understanding of Newtonianism, where is God in your model? And he says, I don't need no God in my model, right? So this kind of very famous, right? Like where you really push back. No, this is much more about the Catholic Church as an institution and the authority of the Catholic Church over interpreting all these kind of phenomena. And he questioned that, and that's why he was taken to court.
Right. And also, I think there were several philosophers who shared this argument, isn't it? That we don't no longer need to require the religious explanation to understand our world. Rather, there are other universal laws, and we can use the faculty of reason to understand them. So it was not only in the realm of science, but also in the realm of philosophy, economics, for example, or political science, for example.
But obviously, what we have to understand, there was no science as such, right? I mean, the concept of science, it would all be under philosophy, right? Like we would have the terms of natural philosophy, experimental philosophy, obviously the experiment. So very much what this kind of turn towards science is to take the nature as measure, right? Like obviously we have both, you can say, a neo-Aristotelian and a neo-Platonic influences that are coming in. You can say the neo-Aristotelian. So this is really a rediscovery, and this is also very interesting, a rediscovery which has happened in the early Renaissance period of Greek texts. And this is very much related again, since we've been talking about is this kind of a European phenomenon or not, has really a lot to do with the contact with other cultures. Because a lot of these Greek texts had been lost in Europe, and through retranslation movements. So there has been a translation movements during early Islam and up to 1000. There has been a translation movement where Islamic scholars have collected a lot of knowledge, both from the Greek world, but we also have these examples in India, right? Like have translated a lot of Hindu text and this whole movement of the Zero, for example, to Europe, right? Like which happened through the Islamic world. So there was this discovery of these Greek texts, and there were kind of both neo-Aristotelian, so Aristotelian, which was kind of very empiricist. So we really have to learn from nature. We have to discover things in nature. And Platonic, Neo-Platonic, which goes more towards geometrization, mathematical models, and reason, right? So one of the philosophers, obviously, who was very central was René Descartes and Cartesianism, right? Which really also this kind of idea, and this is again where we can go back to Galilei and the rise of mechanics, actually as a way of explanation, and like the kind of mechanization of the world. So if you want to understand, so the kind of underlying ideology would be, if you want to understand how the world works, you have to prescribe the mechanism. You have to prescribe the mechanism how the world works. So mechanization was very much at the center
Yes,
of,
yes,
of this program. Even though we have to understand that this is, again, I wouldn't describe these all as kind of linear phenomena. I mean, obviously, if you can say mechanization, there is still a lot of open space of debates, right? Like, and specifically if we talk about what has been ruling then as a kind of mechanical worldview until the end of the 19th century, there's never been like kind of one homogeneous way of how this was understood. There were a lot of different kind of programs under this kind of program of mechanization.
Another very important figure whom we must discuss, I believe, is Charles Darwin.
Oh yeah,
isn't it? His theory of evolution
yes.
really fundamentally transformed, and it really took on some of the very fundamental and cardinal arguments of the church. So what were the kind of reactions and what were the kind of engagements that happened between the church and his very anti-religious arguments?
I mean, at that point, first thing we would have to say there was not the church, right? Like, and the church, also different kind of churches and different kind of church branches of churches. Obviously, we had different Protestant. We had the Catholic Church, we have the Catholic Church, and different Protestant versions of the church. So there has not been any kind of uniform reaction of the church to Darwinism. First, I would say, obviously, I would even like to go a little bit back in time and the rise of natural philosophy and really kind of the abandonment of a kind of religious-based understanding. I mean, there were new classification systems coming in botany and zoology, specifically with the Linnaean system coming up, right? And as I already said, there were a lot of specimens coming from all places in the world. And before we have Darwinian evolution, we have earlier models of evolution. For example, I mean, the best known is Lamarck. So French zoologist who has brought up his own system of evolution, which was very different fundamentally, in many ways fundamentally different from Darwinian evolution. Because in the Lamarckian evolution, every species has its very own, very separate trajectory of evolution. So there is not the kind of tree of evolution which we have with Darwinian evolution. So ideas of evolutions were there before, right? Like so it wasn't really so Lamarckian evolution, and still you find some people, obviously Darwinian evolution is overwhelmingly accepted in the scientific community, but there are still some people who adhered to the idea of Lamarckian evolution. As we know, there's also a lot of critiques, not in the scientific community, but outside of Darwinian evolution. Then the other thing was really debates about the geology and the age of the Earth. So people like, for example, Alexander von Humboldt. So you had a lot of these kind of scientific voyages. You had in the British world more known like the Cook exhibition as well. But Alexander von Humboldt, who was a German scientist, also kind of more like a universal scientist, who has also done these kind of voyages, went to the Andes, for example, and tried to understand. This was also very typical for the times of the Enlightenment. So doing these kind of voyages and collecting specimens from natural history, so both zoology and botany, but also from geology, right? Like geological specimens, and then do all kinds of measurements. So magnetic, meteorological measurements. So collecting a lot of data, right? Like and trying to make sense. So organize, systematize, quantify, not in the same way, obviously, if you think about zoology and botanics, not to that extent, but specifically if we think about meteorology, and rather than having really models of the weather, but first like collecting data, right? Like this is really the beginnings if you want to know when did we really, specifically now in the times of global climate change, when did we really start collecting systematically weather data? It really goes back to
this time,
to the 18th century, right? Like collecting all this kind of data and trying to make sense of this data, right? And within that, it became increasingly difficult to argue that the world would only be 5,000 years old. that just didn't work anymore, right? Like there was a lot of controversy also, even in the 19th century, about the age of the Earth, because there was still the question, obviously another science came up, the science of thermodynamics, and people would argue, but the Earth cannot be older than 5,000 years because then it would be much colder. Obviously, they didn't know about radioactivity and radioactive phenomenon that contribute to the energy equation, right? But there was this whole conflict about the age of the Earth, and there was very clear that the Bible could not be right. So all this kind of data, and also if you look at Charles Darwin, he really started out as this kind of classical, you can say, natural philosopher who traveled around the world, went to the Galapagos Islands, went to other islands, and was basically collecting botanical, zoological, geological specimens, right? Like, so this was really the kind of museum collection type rather than the experimental type of science, right? Like you have these two different traditions really, like working with collections and specifying them, going out to the field, or experimental philosophy, doing experiments in the laboratory, which then very much in the 19th century, a lot of it comes together, also for biology, but Darwin really coming from this tradition. And in the beginning, again, the resistance of the church, I mean, there is still on the selection of species, right? Like, which was not so controversial for the church as the descent of man, right? Making the suggestion that we are part of the natural selection of species, that we are part of this tree of
evolution.
That was obviously rather controversial, right? Like, but even though I would say, I mean, the reaction of different branches of the church were rather different.
But could you say something more about these different types of reactions, because they fundamentally challenge some of the most important premises of the church about the importance of man, the whole question of creation. So was the church or different branches of church forced to accept it? How did they really deal with it?
You can say regionally there were a lot of differences, right? Like you could say it early on, acceptance was actually rather early, you can say both in Britain, with Huxley, and also in Germany. It was rather early accepted, whereas you had resistance both in France, but also in the United States. And obviously this kind of resistance of the more evangelical churches in the United States, which is still lingering on, even now. Whereas it was quite early on accepted in the United Kingdom. What is very important about Darwinism was obviously, and if we come to sociology, was kind of the extension of, and this is also which we today would rather criticize, was obviously that a lot of racist theories came up, and the kind of extension of Darwinism into other fields than
social Darwinism.
Social Darwinism, which was actually not very much covered by, I mean, Darwin himself never made any pronouncements on this, and was kind of an extension, and specifically also if you look at the colonized world and colonial science, and how science was used as a tool to govern the colonies, and specifically if you look at anthropology, the rise of anthropology as a discipline, where kind of physical at the beginning was kind of very much based on physical anthropology, where people try to make claims and extend claims from Darwinian evolution into the social world. I mean, one thing which I have been researching myself is very interesting is music, for example, and the study of music. Because Darwin actually mentions something already on the selection of species. He mentions something on the importance of bird songs and sexual reproduction of birds, right? Like, and then you can also talk about music in the. Obviously, we can discuss a lot about whether birds have music or not, right? Like, a lot of people would very much argue that. but people extended that very much. Musicologists extended that into the human world, and they would be starting to talk about a kind of evolution of music. So people went to places like India or Africa to study music of so-called primitive people, right? Like the idea of primitive people was that primitive people would be on an evolutionary lower scale, right? And if we would want to learn something about the origins of music as a human phenomenon, we would have to study the music of primitive people. Interestingly enough, comparative musicology led to the very fail of that idea. But they figured out actually that obviously music of primitive, so-called primitive people is as complex as other kinds of music, and also the whole idea of a kind of hierarchy of music, which you can say like classical, European classical music as the kind of evolutionary top of that has really been very much, has not, obviously was not substantiated in that research.
But this idea of taking the idea of evolution from the natural world and then into the human world, and to see that human societies across the world are destined to undergo a process of unilinear evolutionary model is something very central to sociology. We have almost all the early sociologists talking about different laws, different stages. Auguste Comte talking about theological, metaphysical, positive, Spencer talking about. So this has been a major argument. So that is why even as a discipline, anthropology has this whole idea of going back to the primitives to see how they are. And simultaneously they would keep the Western Europe as the pinnacle, as having reached the pinnacle of human civilization. And these trends came for much criticism much later, but the early forms was something very similar.
Yes. Obviously you will also have already in the 19th century, if I look at German scholars, obviously there was always a counter movement, right? Like especially if you think about the Romantic movement in Germany, right? Like which was kind of very anti Newtonianism, or this kind of very linear Newtonianism, which looked at kind of more the Romantic natural philosophy movement, which looked rather into the complexity rather than into this very reductionist idea of how Newtonianism at least was understood back then, and the mathematization, right? And similarly also you had a kind of rise of the humanist ideas. So you would find also a lot of scientists would say, look, there is limits to how much we could apply the kind of laws of nature and the kind of mechanization, especially in Germany, if you come the kind of conflict between materialist philosophies and idealist philosophies, right? Who looked at the social world or the human world as fundamentally different from the natural world, right? So you would have these kind of understandings as well, but at the same time, as I said, it's not so unilinear, right? Like you had a lot of variety. So you had a lot of rejection of these kind of ideas already at that time as well. But at the same time, you're totally right. A lot of people really wanted to extend, and specifically wanted to understand, you can say, an idea of a kind of Unitarian science, right? Like there was this idea of the unity of science, of one scientific method. And to extend that to the social realm and to the social science as well. And obviously that the model for that universal scientific method, that was definitely physics, right? So the physical sciences and specifically physics and astronomy as the kind of model how science ought to be done. And you also have this move away, I talked already about the idea of science in the field, or natural philosophy, you can say, in the field as a field activity, this idea of collecting and categorizing and creating order, as opposed to experimental science and the experimental method. But then you also have this idea of the experimental method moving into other realms, right? Like, and you really see that specifically the rise first with chemistry, obviously, chemistry and what we call the chemical revolution with Lavoisier, and shaping a kind of chemistry very similar to physics, but then also the pushback against vitalism, specifically vitalism, and the idea that there is a special living force, as opposed to kind of the conservation of energy. Actually, the conservation of energy was very much the first articulations of conservation of energy came very much to push back ideas of vitalism and of a self-generating living force, right? And then there was also this push in...
Was vitalism backed by certain theological foundations or metaphysical ideas of certain?
I would say rather, more I mean, the stream, at least also vitalism wasn't, with Haeckel, for example, was then also a very strong protagonist of Darwinism in Germany. Vitalism was still very much alive there in Germany, but you can say this has been a controversy that was going on all through the 19th century in Europe, and trying to give kind of mechanical explanation to life phenomena as well. And obviously Darwinism doesn't really fit into the kind of mechanical. I mean, it's a different kind of grand theory that has been coming up in the 19th century, and today we can even see articulations of evolution within the physical world. People talk about the evolution of the universe, for example, right? Like in these kind of things. So extending the reach of kind of evolutionary theories in science, right? Like so what is the reach of these kind of models or theories?
So we will wind up this session, and we'll continue the discussion with more focus on industrial revolution in the next session. Thank you.